The state's persecution of individuals shows that the state does no justice at all. This is Libertarian View, your source of decentralized and distributed information. In a somewhat surprising turn of events, Julian Assange had an unfavorable decision from the British High Court, which previously denied his extradition to the United States in January this year, but ended up going back on that decision last Friday, December 10th, allowing his extradition. He still has the right to appeal, but the situation is not favorable to him. Assange, who is 50 years old, suffered a mini stroke in prison. It may not be a serious problem right now, but it also can be a warning sign of a full stroke in the future. His health is in serious jeopardy. The case against him is absurd and the consequences of his extradition could be far worse than merely his life. But to understand the complexity of the case and the level of damage it could cause, we need to understand the story from the beginning. Julian Assange is an Australian internet activist who in the early 2000s had a brilliant idea, creating a mechanism so that members of governments and big companies who knew of inconvenient secrets or compromising information about the organizations could disclose them anonymously using technology. In case you don't know, governments and big corporations do bad things all the time. They lie, hide data, falsify research, do everything you could possibly think of as rotten, all in the interest of many at their highest ranks. Many of their employees eventually know about these barbarities. Unfortunately, because they need a job or because they fear retaliation, even with evidence of atrocities perpetrated by criminal organizations, they remain silent. If you have a place where you can publicize this information without the risk of being identified or losing your job, this opens up the possibility of a multitude of people in the government to act against its tyranny. Whistleblowers and secret sources have always existed in journalism. There have always been people who show the atrocities of those organizations, but it has always been a difficult process because it requires trust on both sides. How do you know if a reporter you're talking to will be careful enough? How do you know if the government or the company won't be able to convince the person to turn over their source? A website powered by technological features allow this kind of thing in a much more automated way, with more guarantees for all parties involved. And Assange's idea was implemented in 2006 as the WikiLeaks website, which allows anyone who enters the deep web via Tor network, an encrypted anonymizing network, to send complaints, documents, and information that are later made available on a website on the surface web for anyone who wants to consult them. The systems are still working, by the way, both the deep web portal and the surface web information website. However, the US government didn't like when some of their documents were leaked this way. In 2010, a US military intelligence analyst, Chelsea Manning, who had access to a lot of classified information, used the website to publish a huge quantity of documents on the Afghanistan and Iraqi wars. That information was explosive and generated headlines throughout that year and the next, mainly because it exposed war scenes and dialogues between commanders and soldiers. Some scenes are shocking. Here are just a few examples out of the many available on that leak. Baghdad 2007. The crews of 2 US Army helicopters observe a few of mine in the path of the US ground troops, some of them armed. But among that group there are 2 journalists working for Reuters. One of them holds a camera, which is misidentified by the helicopter pilot as a weapon. The pilot asks for permission to shoot. Permission is granted. One of the journalists dies. After the lead helicopter fires, one of the crew members shouts, "Sorry, haha, I hit them, I think." Later, another member of the crew says, "Oh yeah, look at those dead bastards." Later on, a van approaches the severely wounded journalist to pick him up. The helicopter pilot fires at the van and its occupants. The shots are so strong that they blast the van by several meters. Soldiers and their superiors make joke about the attack. The journalist was killed along with other men. However, 2 children not known to be in the van at that point were also injured in the process. Sometime later, they were found by ground troops and extracted from the burning van. When the helicopter pilot discovers that they have killed a number of Iraqi civilians and wounded 2 children, one of them is heard to say, "Well, it's their fault for bringing kids into the battle." Actually, there is nothing really new here. Everyone knows that war is dirty, and there is a lot of sadism in these attacks, but it didn't sound well for an army that was supposedly freeing the country from a dictatorship. Iraq was indeed governed by a terrible dictator, Saddam Hussein, a cruel and bloodthirsty dictator. But the fundamental issue remains: does the end justify the means? Both the Iraqi and American people were deceived in a war that lasted years and consumed countless resources with no clear purpose. Today, we know that the purpose of that war was quite another. No, it wasn't oil. It was the petrodollar laundering scheme made to ensure that other currencies are not used to trade the dollar. The fact is that the WikiLeaks website worked exactly as expected. Unfortunately, Manning shared the data not only with the website but also with an acquaintance by other means. She was then arrested by the American government. She was charged with 22 crimes, which could have resulted in a death sentence, but actually resulted in her being sentenced to 35 years in jail and dishonorable discharge. She ended up serving 7 years in jail, having been released in 2017. She was even arrested again in 2019 for refusing to testify against Assange in a court of law. Assange did humanity a favor by exposing information that affects the lives of thousands of people. Information that was kept secret not because it's actually harmful to the US government. No secret agent names or strategical plans have been released, but only information that was owned to American individuals who bankroll all the fake of the Iraqi war with the money the government stole from them through taxes, and to the Iraqi and Afghanistan citizens who were invaded by a foreign country that generated far more civilian deaths than that of 9/11 did to the US. Assange didn't even leak any documents because he didn't have any privileged access. However, he was tried in absentia and convicted of treason. He was in Sweden when he was convicted, and the Swedish government appears to have fabricated a rape charge against him to arrest and thus deport him to the United States. Oh, the rape charge was dropped later, by the way. Julian Assange skipped bail and managed to flee to London, where in 2012 he took refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy, where he stayed for 7 years and was basically untouchable. Things turned a little more dark to him in 2016 US election campaign, when WikiLeaks published confidential Democratic Party emails. The leaked emails showed that the party committee favored Hillary Clinton over her rival Bernie Sanders in the primaries, that Clinton used to get the questions in advance to CNN debates, that her campaign officials disdain Catholics, Southerners, needy Latinos, among other unpleasant things. The Clintons' campaign, however, refused to comment about the emails, instead blaming the Russians for hacking the emails and providing them to WikiLeaks. Clinton said Assange needed to answer for what he had done. Finally, in 2019, the Ecuadorian government, along with the British Parliament, both certainly under pressure of the American government, expelled him from the embassy, and he was then in prison in England, where he remains ever since. He's been trying to avoid extradition to the United States ever since, and if you're wondering why, well, first because the crimes he is being charged with can result in death penalty, although this is unlikely. The biggest problem here is torture. The American government wants to silence the voice of those officials who may want to turn against it, so things like that won't happen again. More than that, it wants to pressure Assange for information about all the leaks that have happened. And here we find the biggest nonsense of all. The only people who should be facing criminal charges in this entire scenario are the people inside the government who committed the crimes revealed by Assange and Manning, but there have been no repercussions thus far. Assange was merely doing what a vast majority of mainstream media has long since neglected: his job. Without whistleblowers like him, citizens would have no idea what the government is actually up to, the corruption in wars, the human rights violations carried out, how the taxpayer money is really spent, and what's being done in the name of the people. We need more, a lot more, not less of this. And the prosecution of Assange scares the other journalists from doing their jobs. Even the America's founding fathers already knew how important a free press is. To quote them, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers, or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the last one." Thomas Jefferson. Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech. Benjamin Franklin. Besides that, Assange's prosecution shows us another important lesson. state justice is not de facto justice. It is merely an instrument to persecute people who goes against the state. State justice, being coercive as it is, can never be considered real justice, since it's allowed to judge facts involving the government itself. Even though allegedly there are guarantees for the judge to be able to decide freely, one cannot forget that judges are an employee of the state. There will always be a weight in deciding against the hand that feeds you. Real justice only happens when it's made by private arbiters, voluntarily chosen by the parties. There are lots of buildings out there with names like Supreme Court of the State ABC, but that's not real justice. It is a mechanism of state oppression. If Assange is finally extradited, WikiLeaks will continue to exist, but a very clear message will be sent out to anyone who may ever consider leaking facts that are inconvenient to governments. We will hunt you down, no matter how many layers of encryption you use. A tragedy indeed that shows some clear truths. Governments don't really care about the safety of anyone, only the safety of its own officials, of the government's own members. It is a tragedy indeed that shows some clear truths. Governments don't really care about the safety of anyone, except for the safety of its own officials and members. And they will cooperate with each other whenever they see fit, and regardless of what the laws say. Sweden, England, Ecuador, none of them needed much more than a sheer interest to help another government in silencing dissent. But thankfully some hope still remains. The WikiLeaks website is still online. People in governments are still using it to disclose facts and leak data. Governments have always taken advantage of the fact that they are older and of lasting longer than any individual. Technology, however, makes ideas of freedom even more enduring and appealing. Ross Ulbricht, who created a libertarian deep website and was harassed and imprisoned by the US government, is also fighting for his freedom. But today, you may find dozens of black market sites on the deep web inspired by the legendary Silk Road. State violence can certainly affect individuals, but it cannot destroy ideas. Quoting the movie V for Vendetta, ideas are bulletproof. Thank you for watching. This article was written by Peter Tuguniev, translated by Daniel Peterson, revised by Korea Konka, and narrated by Vasily Berokiev. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up icon down below and share it with your social network. If you want to be notified about other videos, hit subscribe and then hit the bell icon. See you soon!